Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the segment where we're featuring what we think are one of the best healthcare venture investors globally. And I'm super excited to be talking with Cyril. He's the principal at Providence Ventures. Cyril, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I'm really glad to be on this interview here and join you and provide some insights into my fund and our investment strategy to your audience.
Cool. Well, to kind of give the audience perspective. I mean, you were one of the first and founding team members of Providence Ventures. You were there at the beginning, 2015. Am I right?
Yeah.
And it's really impressive, not only your background jumping into this, but what have you guys done and created at Providence Ventures. And so you have not only impressive portfolio, you leverage a giant CVC, you have incredible content that you guys produce constantly, by far one of the top healthcare venture investors globally. So I'm super happy to not only feature you and be here to interview you. I mean, this is great. So
I appreciate the accolades.
I want to start off just so that the audience is clear. Can you give for those who maybe don't know who Providence is, can you start with who is Providence and then also what does Providence Venture do? What is the fund? What are you guys focused on?
Yeah, so Providence Ventures, we're the venture fund for Providence, which is a large West Coast health system. From a scale standpoint, we have over 50 hospitals across 7 states. We have over 1,000 outpatient facilities of some kind, and that includes SNFs, ASCs, home hospices, everything in between. We also have a health plan that covers over 500,000 lives, and then also ACO initiatives that cover over 1 million lives. In addition to that, we're also an employer of over 100,000 people. And so from a scale perspective, Providence is one of the larger health systems in the US. From an investment standpoint, that gives us as investors of Providence an opportunity to look at investments from a multitude of different lenses, which is helpful. So we could look at companies that sell into the traditional provider realm, the ASC realm, or outpatient realm, payers, or even to employers. And so that helps our fund a lot when it comes to looking at investments and kind of exploring the landscape of everything that health technology services, medical devices, and everything in between fit into the broader spectrum of healthcare. With respect to the fund itself, so we manage $300 million of capital on behalf of Providence. We typically look to put checks in the 5 to 10 million range initially, and then reserve kind of around 15 to 20 over the life of an investment. So, from a stage standpoint, it's typically targeting Series B type investments. But if you look at our portfolio, you'll notice that there's quite a variety of the types of companies in there. We have some really late stage opportunities in companies and some more earlier stage ones. And that kind of ties into how the fund operates, which is we invest with kind of a dual purpose. First, we obviously want to generate returns. I mean, we're managing a significant amount of capital on behalf of Providence, although in the scheme of the size of Providence, it's not really that much. But the second aspect of what we look at from every investment is that strategic value add. And I think that's what differentiates us from many other investors out there, in that we won't make an investment in a company unless we see some sort of strategic benefit to Providence, as well as a way that we can add value to said company. And so that's a critical part of our diligence process, and how we operate and how we add value. And if you look through kind of, as you highlighted up front, like some of the pedigrees that we've had since I started at Providence, many of our earlier investments have seen uptake across our system as well as external to Providence through that strategic alignment component. And we look at that as a key way that we can generate value for our portfolio companies, and hopefully in the end, and it has shown already, generate some positive returns for our fund.
Awesome. And I think you kind of already mentioned it, the rationale why, but before we even get into the investment thesis and your portfolio and really cool aspects of your fund, do you know the backstory about why Providence decided to start their own venture arm?
Yeah, I was there when we kind of came up with the idea, and it's kind of strange because back then in 2015, like late 2014, early 2015, there were actually a bunch of strategic venture funds that were launched around kind of that same time frame. And I'd say like the original purpose of our fund, which is still partially our purpose and definitely a reason why we're still in operations, is we were meant as a way for startups to engage a large health system. And so if you look at kind of the realm of the vendor universe in healthcare, like you have these large EHRs and large vendors that tend to dominate discussions at a high level with respect to operational and clinical leadership. And what we were trying to do is create kind of an even playing field for startups who are innovative and doing things that can really move the needle for Providence and give them a chance to get exposure to the highest levels within Providence. And so that was kind of the original purpose of the fund. We've kind of had some starts and stops in terms of trying to adjust that strategy and the reality of venture investing, because if we want to put money to work, we can't just always wait on like kind of a timeline of a health system buying process. Health system sales cycles last forever, and trying to wait for that to go through doesn't really work. And so, but what we've done is we've really built a model that's focused around engaging our operational leaders in finding what are their problems, what are their key pain points, and then going out to the market and finding innovative companies that can address those pain points and making those introductions there. And what that's resulted in is a lot of really innovative companies out there getting their first exposure into Providence through our fund, and eventually getting contracts, and eventually us being able to invest in said companies and generate value beyond that. But we still have that core mission around, like, if we see a really interesting company out there, I mean, we're at conferences, normally we're at conferences, we're out in the market talking to our co-investors, and we see a lot of innovative companies that, for lack of better, or for just lack of perspective, many of our operational and clinical leaders, they just don't have exposure to the world that we live in. And so we introduced those companies as well. And for many of those, similarly, like just getting that exposure to Providence, and hopefully for some of them getting that customer relationship has been pivotal to their success. And so that's kind of how we fit into the story of Providence, if that makes sense, and kind of how we got started and how we got to where we are today.
No, it absolutely makes sense, and it's a good strategy, especially for a big behemoth like yourself.
Yeah.
Your fund, you may have you've kind of already answered the next question, but I want to highlight it. You focus on some big healthcare categories. So you get medical devices, you do healthcare software, you do healthcare services. Healthcare is huge. I mean, it's a massive industry, much bigger than most of the other categories that we looked at. How do you filter this down? I mean, you talked a little bit about how, you might start by identifying needs within within Providence, but then at the same time, are you looking externally and seeing what are opportunities, whether it's disease verticals or tools, and then try to bring that back in? How do you filter through this complexity of so many deals?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I think one of the benefits of being part of such a large health system is that, like, we have such strong relationships with our operational and clinical leaders that pretty much every time we see an innovative company out there, like, we could just run it past somebody and get their sense for, hey, is this a legitimate problem that they're solving, and is this like an actual company, like, will you actually pay for this? And that helps kind of narrow down the world a lot, and faster than a lot of other funds can do that, just because we have access to such a large network. And so that's one way that we're able to kind of quiet down the market, kind of resize the market a little bit downward. But I'd say to your earlier point, I mean, there's so many innovative companies out there that, even with a team of 8 that we have at Providence Ventures, we can never cover kind of the full landscape. Another way that we're actually able to find innovative companies is there are innovative companies working within Providence today. And so when I'm out and I'm talking to our Southern California region, which is one of our more forward-leaning regions, doing some really innovative stuff down in the LA market, like, they're always working with some really intriguing companies. And we're actually introduced to many companies through them. And some of these are some of the leading companies out there in the health tech space. And so, there are different ways that we could kind of go to the market and kind of narrow it down to companies that make the most sense. One is through just proactive outreach and through our network, as well as what's already being used and being effective within the system itself. And so that's one way we do it. And then to your point, like if we see a really innovative company, especially in forward-leaning areas. So for example, in like, our like robotic process automation, or in like artificial intelligence, like the type of companies that maybe won't get that much exposure traditionally within Providence, just because it's hard concepts to understand for many of our operators, and that it may not necessarily be like what they live and breathe. We still strive to bring those to our operational leaders and get their thoughts on it. And sometimes it doesn't work out. It may not necessarily be a fit, but at the same time, we educate them, and we also get educated on ourselves in terms of, maybe the market's not necessarily ready for that type of AI or that type of RPA type solution. And so, it's kind of like a good symbiotic relationship with our LP in a sense, that we're able to get so much value in so many different ways.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a great resource to kind of fall back as a tool for both due diligence, deal flow, and a variety of other opportunities. I'm curious though, but when looking at your portfolio, it seems like a lot of your investments tend to be around what I call considered operational, catered more to providers. And it seems like sometimes providers might shy away from investing in products that they would actually become a customer of, versus just reselling. So why do you kind of skew this route? I mean, I'm curious, is it, are you not afraid of products, or are you afraid of products that actually might be touching patient care and your EHR systems and everything like this? I mean, I'm curious to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'd say, like, if you look at our portfolio, one unifying characteristic is that every single one of our portfolio companies are striving to improve the patient experience or patient outcomes in some capacity, even the ones that may seem very operationally focused. And so, for example, if you look at one of our more recent investments in a company called Protennis, which essentially is a patient privacy monitoring solution that our compliance teams use to identify bad actors who are maybe accessing improper medical records, so medical records of people they may not have access to, or they should not have access to, or similar. Again, if you break it down, like in the end, that's really helping improve the patient experience by ensuring that our patients' data is secure. Similarly, if you look at some of the other operationally focused portfolio companies, like Trilliant, so Trilliant Health helps our system identify markets to expand to by providing market research analytics. So information on how many surgeries are done in a specific geography, or how many surgeries does a certain practice has. And again, that makes it or makes our system able to identify what are the needs in a certain market, or what are the gaps in a certain market within our geographies that we should be addressing for our patients, and providing a better experience for them, better access to care. And if you go through like pretty much all of our portfolio, you'll see kind of that common thread. The other thing I'll add around kind of, staying away from patient care, like we generally don't shy away from companies that are directly impacting patient care. And so for many of our companies, they're directly interacting with the patient in some capacity, although it may be branded Providence. And so to be clear, so like, for example, our portfolio company, Wildflower Health, essentially powers an app at Providence called Circle, which is given to mothers of newborns and provides them trusted information from Providence. But if you ask one of our pregnant patients, like they won't necessarily know what Wildflower is, but they'll know what Circle is and Circle by Providence is. And so even though they may not be directly interacting with patients, and that's not true for all our portfolio, but even if they aren't, they are providing value in that scheme. And then the last point in terms of kind of the issues around like, like patient care and potential conflicts there. For us, we're acutely aware of just, how we're operating. I mean, we're a health system investing in startups, and many of them do have that patient angle. And so we have a very strong conflict of interest policy that we've developed with our legal counsel, both internal and external. And, we pride ourselves, as every other venture fund out there that you've talked to and that I've talked to, on just, making sure that we hold true to the safeguarding of information. And so, we're very cognizant of that. And we strive to ensure that, we create an environment and we invest in companies that are really above board and are doing value and are adding value to our patients and to our health system.
Interesting. And, I'm curious because, you're both a provider and, more of a growth stage investor. And, from your perspective, are you investing in products that are more practical, that can actually be deployed easily in the healthcare ecosystem? Or you tend to gravitate more towards moonshots? Because healthcare investing is tough. It's probably one of the most toughest categories you can go after. I mean, you have a great resource behind you and knowledge, but I'm curious on your perspective, especially as an investment arm.
Yeah.
Is it more practical tools, or are we going moonshots?
Yeah, Kyle, I really appreciate that question because it does highlight one of the challenges we have as a strategic fund, which is, we really only will invest in companies that are actually able to work with Providence. And, some of the really innovative, forward-thinking companies out there are really early stage, and they may not have the customers, but they'll have an idea which can really change the market, and they've proven out that idea at maybe other health systems or whatnot. And unfortunately for those, we may not necessarily be able to invest in them today. But at the same time, we still want to talk to them, because if we talk to them, we'll introduce them internally and then they could get that exposure. And so that does kind of limit the amount of kind of quote unquote moonshot type investments that we have in our portfolio. Also, we don't invest in therapeutics or anything along those lines, which many of the kind of moonshot type companies are focused on. But if you look at our portfolio, we do have some really high performing portfolio companies. So for example, Lira Health in the behavioral health realm just raised at a valuation of like close to or above $1 billion. And so I would consider them kind of in kind of that moonshot type category, like Omada Health, which helps provide solutions to engage people to prevent diabetes. Like they've raised a significant amount of money and have gotten a lot of traction, very similar to Livongo, which went public and got acquired recently. And so we do have some really high performing companies. Oh, and then One Medical also, which went public like earlier this year. And so we have some really high performing companies in our portfolio, even despite that fact. But it is somewhat of a hindrance sometimes in that we really do need to work with companies that can work with Providence. And so that may mean that we end up investing in a later round than that first seed round and at a higher valuation, which maybe it'll work well for the founders. So it's all good for us.
Interesting. You're in a very unique spot, especially in this being a venture investor. And with that, being in the side where you can actually see what a lot of providers use, how patient care is actually managed, and a lot of the needs of the healthcare system. I'm curious though, what is something that most people don't see in the healthcare industry, and what is something that has kind of shaped your healthcare investment thesis when starting Providence Ventures?
Yeah, another great question. I look at my background just to give some insights to the audience. I started out my career in the investment banking world, and I worked with kind of large companies, did the whole pitches and all the pitch books and the Excel models, et cetera. And then I moved into private equity, where I worked with kind of middle market companies, including some healthcare companies. But when I came to Providence, I really understood very quickly just the reality of the healthcare system overall. And there are some truths that you've highlighted earlier in this conversation, Kyle, around that longer sales cycle and kind of the challenges of operating in this market. And I don't think many entrepreneurs earlier on, especially back in 2015, 2016, kind of just jumped into healthcare thinking that if they had a solution outside of healthcare, it could just it could easily go into healthcare, because those inefficiencies in healthcare can easily be overcome, because in the airline industry it was overcome. And so airlines and healthcare are very similar. And so I get the premise around it, and I really love that enthusiasm that those entrepreneurs had, and many of them are still very successful out in the market. But the one thing I realize is that healthcare is just very slow to change, and those sales cycles are just going to stay long. There's no way to really reduce them, mainly because that's just how budgeting is done. We're part of the budget process at our system too. And so, that's just how the industry works. And being a part of a health system venture fund gives me exposure to that, where I kind of understand. And then the second aspect is like there are particular groups within a health system and within a broader IDN or payer that are more innovative and more forward leaning than others. And it's mainly due to like just like the specifics of how they operate, meaning like they may be a more leaner type group, they may be more open. And so I think having an ally within a health system like a corporate venture fund like us can help you navigate to those groups more quickly and get your product off the ground, because like healthcare overall is slow, but it's not like not every piece of it is slow. And so I think that's something that I learned as well, that coming from the outside you could just be like, oh yeah, everyone's slow, everything's slow, but like some things are less slow than others. And it's really cool to see and be on the inside. And it's something that being outside of the healthcare realm, even in investing, like you just don't really see very easily.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, it's a really unique position to be in. And I want to switch gears now. I want to focus on your portfolio. Before I highlight a couple companies that some of which you already mentioned, I'm just curious. As your portfolio is big, but you cover a lot of healthcare categories already. But does this sometimes, can it be limiting? If you're investing in a great product and telemedicine, and then all of a sudden, is that set the rest of the telemedicine category off limits as a provider? It's kind of weird, because what happens if there's another great company that already starts working with Providence? And do you feel sometimes you might miss out on opportunities? So I'm just curious how you manage this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like when I think about my history at Providence Ventures, being here for 5 years, like there's been plenty of companies that we've just lost the ability to invest in because, our system may not necessarily be prepared for it. Like it may be a solution that along the priority ladder that, is set by our leadership, it's just in a lower priority stack. And then by the time it gets to the top of that stack, like we can't invest because the valuation's like 1.5 billion, and like it won't really matter putting in 10 million even. So yeah, I think we've definitely have those type of deals where it may not actually come to fruition in the timeline that we want. And so like we've lost a lot of deals, but then on the flip side, we've gotten into a lot of deals because of the value we can bring. And so if you look at our portfolio, like many of the companies are ones that we were already working with before we invested, and we showed our value add as kind of customers, and then parlayed that into an investment opportunity, because then you'll have like a dedicated team, the Providence Ventures team, which will help you expand and grow within Providence. And so I think there's pluses and minuses to our model in that respect. I'd say with respect to the like introducing companies that don't get like that aren't investable opportunities, because like for us, going back to what I was saying earlier, like one of our goals is to introduce companies into Providence that are innovative. Those companies may not all be investable opportunities. Like it may be that X company just closed around 2 months ago and they're not looking to reopen it, but hey, like that company is adding a ton of value for Dignity or for Kaiser or for other health systems. And so our health system leadership needs to be aware of it. And for us, that's still kind of a win, because, we're generating strategic value to Providence, which is part of our dual purpose. And so, we're always open to having conversations with innovative companies, like regardless of the fundraising status. I think ideally, we'd like to have like a combination of an investment plus the strategic value add. And I think we can prove that if we have that, that actually makes it much more valuable. It solidifies that relationship, and kind of makes things a little bit more easier to navigate within the system. But that being said, it's still a win if we introduce a company that's going to save Providence, $100 million for whatever part, like for whatever they can do, or generate $100 million of additional revenue. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. I know there's a couple of other things mixed in there, but hopefully that gives you a sense for kind of our model and why it's sometimes just so broad in a sense.
No, it definitely makes sense. And at the end goal is to support Providence and your services. And so It's great that you have a variety of different tool sets and methods to do so. I wanted to talk now specifically about some really exciting companies already within your portfolio. First one being Twistle. Twistle being managing care pathways at home. And I'd love to have you kind of give some background on what this company does and what they're working on. But you're actually working with them. Providence is working with them on a specific use case for COVID. So I'd love if you could highlight who is Twistle, but how you guys are working with them and what makes them exciting.
Yeah, and Twistle is a great example of just kind of what I articulated before around like a company that's been working with Providence for a long time, and then we jumped on as investors and then helped accelerate their growth through expansion of access to different different expansion opportunities within Providence. And so Twistle, just as background, is a company that essentially empowers care pathways and care journeys for patients. And so an example of this would be if you or a family member is going in for like a total joint replacement surgery or something similar. The traditional way of handling that is, you kind of just go in for your pre-op appointment. They give you a packet, like you go home, they call you when you need to come back in, you show up, you do the surgery, they give you another packet, like you go home, and you have to come back in 2 weeks for like a follow-up. Like there's no continuation of care in that experience. And so something that Providence organization thought of about 3 or 4 years ago is a concept called simplifying care. And it was around, hey, we have all of these like procedures that should have a connected experience and they're not. And so they went out in the market in conjunction with our digital strategy team, which is part of the broader digital organization of Providence, to survey the market to find solutions which can fit into that realm. And eventually Twistle and a couple of others were kind of selected to be piloted together at different sites. Like Twistle beat all of the competition by miles, and like it was well regarded. And so we adopted it, and this was a couple of years ago. And then the opportunity came to invest in the company earlier this year. And so we invested in the company, and this was pre-COVID. And post our investment, we helped them expand their footprint within Providence through kind of just visibility. As I referenced before, like once we make an investment in a company, like everyone within Providence is aware of said company. And this is a company that was already working with Providence. It already had a pretty strong following, and like we helped accelerate it. And one of the use cases that showed the value add and actually helped propel it even further within Providence is the work that they did around COVID, which is essentially enabling Providence to monitor patients at home who exhibited COVID symptoms, and so it avoided them having to come in every week or every couple of days. If they felt ill, they can just kind of report on their app like what symptoms they had, and then once it reached a certain point, they would be told to come in. And so that way it kind of helped ease some of the congestion issues that our EDs and our facilities had kind of during the front end of the pandemic. And Twistle spun up that solution very, very quickly. I mean, their team is amazing. Like they're able to get things up off the ground really effectively. And so kudos to them in terms of enabling that. But, again, it just goes to show that like, our portfolio companies, whether big or small, and Twistle's a relatively smaller one of our portfolio companies, like adds a lot of value to Providence as well as gets a lot of value from Providence as a customer.
Really cool. Really interesting. Really interesting. And you also have another portfolio company that we wanted to highlight, which is, you already mentioned it, Lira, which is the behavioral health company. And you talked about now they're already at $1 billion valuation. What are you excited about this company, and what potential do you see in a company like Lira? First, before we'll go back, behavioral health is baseline. So maybe introduce or talk a little bit more about what they do, and then get into the exciting part.
Yeah. So Lira Health is a behavioral health company that essentially enables employers to provide an alternative to an employee assistance program, so an EAP program, that instead of focusing on either like just like one-off type assistance type programs, like you call in the EAP line and get help for whatever you're facing. Instead, they have a more structured program which provides access to actual therapists for employees. And so what they've seen is that providing actual therapists and like building that network of therapists that they can provide to employees results in much stronger, better outcomes and satisfaction on the employer side, as well as kind of improved metrics in terms of like less time taken away, better satisfaction on the employment side. And so the company has made a lot of traction in kind of the employer realm around essentially replacing old style EAP systems. The way I think about Lira is it's really one of the stars of our portfolio. And it's not only because of their capital raising effectiveness. I mean, they had two very significant financing rounds in this year alone in the COVID times. And so, and it's great to see the success. I mean, their management team led by Dave Ebersman has a lot of respect within Providence. Like they come and they're working on a variety of different initiatives within Providence, not only on the employer side, but in other areas as well. They just have a lot of, they've proven their value to the broader market as well as to Providence. Like within Providence, we're mainly using them as kind of for certain geographies to be that EAP service. And those geographies have shown a significant improvement and kind of positive outcomes as a result of Lira. And, I think the last thing I'll say on them is that, that they're solving like one of the biggest problems in the healthcare industry, which is around behavioral health, and is an area of focus for us ever since I joined, but probably before that as well, in terms of finding solutions that can really make an impactful change for patients and people in general in that realm. And so, I'm looking forward to really seeing that company grow further, and like with the capital it's got this year, like I think it's, as I alluded to before, it's kind of one of the moonshot type companies that I'm really excited about.
Really cool. Awesome. I mean, congrats on working with with a few great companies.
Appreciate it.
It's you kind of highlighted this a little bit, but I'm curious to get your perspective on the idea. Your portfolio has a mix of both software that's might be for specific conditions, and then software we talk about, like Twistle, for example, is more of a platform play that can manage care pathways for a variety of different individuals across internally across your hospital. And so I'm curious, what do you think is the right approach for health management? And do you guys tend to focus more specific verticals for managing conditions, or are you looking more on platform plays?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And like the way I like to think about it is, I think overall there's a place in the market for both large platform type offerings as well as kind of more like point solution type offerings. Excuse me. So from a platform perspective, if you look at some of our portfolio companies, like you mentioned, like Zelt, like they empower health systems to prescribe digital health apps more broadly, while solutions like Omada focus on specific chronic condition management or identification. And I think both of those have a place in Providence, and both of those have a place in the market. I think the difference is for the platform plays, like it's much harder to scale those companies, because you need customers to really dive in. Like for Twistle, we're a large customer of theirs. They have some other great customers, but it takes time to get customers up to speed and using multiple pathways. But like for other ones that are more kind of single issue oriented, it's a little faster from adoption curve. And so, I'd say like it kind of like there's no real right approach for health management. I think both of those are effective and both of those has their place. I think like if you're an entrepreneur or you're a startup, they're looking to kind of figure out, hey, should I make a platform or should I go into a specific chronic condition? Like the speed of adoption is kind of the critical factor that you need to figure out. And so like I guess maybe this is not necessarily exactly the question, but the advice I'd say is, if you're looking to like build a platform, make sure you have a lot of capital because you're going to need the runway to get it. And if you have kind of more chronic condition, make sure you get that adoption quickly, because then you'll get your capital. Because if I'm an investor, I'm going to look at that first on that side. And so, I guess in summary, you can look at kind of both sides of those to be effective, and we've seen it be effective within our portfolio as well.
I like that advice. It's true. It definitely makes sense. And especially when you're talking about healthcare, the variety of different patients and the variety of different issues that you can have. And, you know, it's quite intense. So it definitely makes sense where you'd have to raise more capital as a platform play versus, garner interest as a, specific health management solution. Switching gears now, more general market questions. You talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's notorious. The healthcare ecosystem has really long sales cycles. It's tough. It's really tough. You're in the hot seat for this. No, I'm joking. But I'm just curious, being especially from an venture investor standpoint, how does this, what is your thoughts on this? And how does this change your perspective, especially when you're looking to invest in companies? I mean, you talked a little bit about, not everything moves slow, but just curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So it's, I guess, like from an investment standpoint, as I alluded to before, like there are going to be really valuable companies, and I've had my fair share of these type of companies where I've bought a deal to the table and like it shows a lot of value add. It's even being used in our health system to some degree, but we can't get it adopted more broadly within Providence. And like, again, that's just the reality that we're in when we're in an industry like this. It doesn't say anything bad about the company or about Providence. It's just more, that's just the reality. And so, it does cause some pain when it comes to like when we look at investments, like we need to be kind of cognizant that, sometimes it won't work out, but in the end, it's not a reflection of what the health system in Providence or what broader healthcare system overall. It's just how the industry is. And so, our goal is just to help companies with the highest potential gain entry into Providence, and we'll give it our best shot to do that and to add value to our potential portfolio companies, as well as our existing portfolio companies to get them there. And, to your point around like, it's just so hard to navigate. It is. And so that's why we really serve as kind of that ally. And so, whenever I talk to entrepreneurs, I kind of highlight the value add that we bring as investors, which is, we meet quarterly with our senior executive team and give them an update on all our portfolio companies. Like, so even if you're like a $5 million ARR company in our portfolio, you're getting exposure to the highest levels of our organization if we're investors. Similarly, anytime we meet, which we do quarterly with our leadership across our clinical, top health, payer, regional, like everything in between, we highlight specific portfolio companies and we work with our portfolio companies around, hey, like, are you in our SoCal region or Southern California region? Are you in our Oregon region? Like, do you want an introduction to them? Are you prepared to service this region? And then we'll make that introduction and provide that value to the right level within the organization. And that kind of subverts some of those challenges that you described that startups face. And so that's a key part of our model, is working with our portfolio companies to get them as much exposure as possible. And just to be clear on one last point, like, we don't make decisions in terms of like whether or not a solution is adopted. Like, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of stay away from that. But what we do provide is that visibility layer, which gives our portfolio companies an evener playing field, I'd say, with some of the larger vendors out there, that they may go head to head with, whether it's a large med device company or a large health tech company, by providing that visibility and providing them as an alternative. And a Providence Ventures portfolio company, it gives kind of additional value add to them in their arsenal. And so that's how we kind of go fight those challenges in a sense.
Interesting. Well, I want to now focus on the big elephant in the room, which is the pandemic. You guys have reports, we call it the COVID Digital Insights series, right? Phenomenal, by the way. Absolutely incredible. I mean, you have a few more, like 4 more reports. I think you're still publishing soon, but you've so far released like 8. And you're literally walking through step by step about what's happened, how to respond, what are the specific technology solutions necessary, how does it affect everything from supply chain to customer or patient trust, and then what do you have to do next? I mean, it's a really great report. it's really, I'm not going to be able to do any justice by asking you questions. I highly encourage the audience to look into this content because it's really great. But I have a couple questions from it. And I know we don't have all the time in the world to go through all of it, so we'll only highlight a little bit. It's really shocking to see something where you talk about in Q1 of this year, you reported a $276 million loss. And that was what seemed like attributed to one, patient fear, not going to the hospital, loss in fee for service, different surgeries, et cetera. On top of that, rise in costs, staffing, equipment, et cetera. And you talk about how the immediate strategy right now is gaining trust back. Square one, that's where you start. And you have a couple solutions to do that. And then building yourself enough runway so you can start to make that switch into what you call the distributed care and digital health acceleration, which is really interesting. And you have a great map for that, by the way. So I'm going to repeat again to the audience. Read these reports, really great. Do you think the switch to digital healthcare is here to stay?
Yeah. So that's a question I kind of sometimes keeps me up at night. If you just look at the stats, right, and these are all kind of in the report, I think in 2019, less than like 12% or so of consumers actually use telehealth, and then this year was close to 50%. And we expect to kind of end the year with potentially 1 billion telehealth visits across the healthcare system, not Providence, but more broadly. And 80% of those are first-time patients. And so when you think about it from that perspective around like whether this is something here to stay, like when you have that much exposure to like a pretty much nascent market, like it's not that easy to kind of pull away. And as part of the research that was done for the reports, which was a collaboration between the ventures team as well as the digital strategy team and a bunch of other folks, as well as if you look at the report, there's like an accolade section around all the people that we interviewed both internally and externally that provided those insights. Like as part of that analysis, we looked at surveys and data around, what do providers think? I think providers, some are still kind of skeptical about kind of the future of virtual care moving forward. But I think more importantly, what we saw is that patients generally are more enthusiastic and more supportive. But the one thing that needs to happen is it just can't be status quo, like a video visit, like kind of what we're doing now, where we're just talking video, like a Zoom meeting isn't going to work forever. Like it may work for another year. Like there still needs to be innovation in there. Virtual visits need to expand to include something along the lines of like what I'd like to see happen in the future is, if I'm seeing a doctor for a primary care visit and they tell me, hey, you need to go see a podiatrist for something wrong with your foot, like I'm going to connect you to one right after this visit so that you can talk to them for 10 minutes. And then right away I get connected to that specialist. That's what I kind of want to see, that seamless type experience where it's not like a disconnected experience. And I think you can do that with virtual care because of the fact that it's so nimble and you're able to do that. And I think if it gets to that point where, you only need to go to the doctor once to get all of your needs addressed for maybe like an hour. And at the same time in the back end, like you have a scribing system that's listening to the virtual visit and logging it all into Epic so that you can see after the fact, like, hey, this is what happened, like this is what you need to do, etc. Like that's kind of the future. And so, like is telehealth here to stay and is virtual care here to stay? Yes, but it's going to need to evolve into something close to that future dream state that I described, which is something as a personal dream, but like, or seems like a dream today, but like the technology is coming. And I think as it evolves, that's definitely going to be something that will stick around.
Interesting. It's definitely the pandemic has really turned the healthcare industry on its head. And there's excitement around pushing towards digital health, distributed care, et cetera. But there's also, in some cases, what you highlight in your reports is there can be some complications too. I mean, I'm curious, there might be issues with dealing with across state health telehealth. Is that okay across country? right? You have regulations that are now trying to say, how do you reimburse telehealth services? And it's leaning towards more favorable. But then you also have situations where, virtual care might be cheaper than in-person care, might cannibalize some business. So it seems like there's also a host of challenges that's going to come along the way. And I'm curious what your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think the regulatory points that you made are really critical to kind of the future growth of telehealth and virtual care in general. I think when we went out and talked to provider systems and payer groups as well as industry experts, we kind of had like a little bit of a mix of like of answers where the payers were like, no way, this is going to stay forever in terms of in-person rates, like everything's going to go down. And then provider systems that we talked to were like, oh, it's definitely going to stay forever in this way because it's just the uptake is so great and people are so used to it and they're going to demand it. And similarly on the labor side, like across state lines, our provider systems were like, yeah, like this will be great because now we can pool resources from multiple different states instead of just our state. And then other groups and staffing teams or staffing organizations were a little bit like, well, I don't think it's going to stay that way because the states have such a strong preference to protect their workers, which is true. And so, what will the end state be? It's another question similar to the last one that keeps me up at night sometimes, in that I think it's going to land somewhere in the middle. And so, with respect to reimbursement rates on telehealth, like what I feel will happen is it's going to be somewhere in between where for certain procedures or for certain telehealth visits, it's going to have to go down than in person. Like, for example, primary care visits, those are very commoditized. Like, it can't stay at the in-person rates forever. Like, it doesn't make sense when you have that much supply and like you can use an ANRP or like, a lower cost provider to, service those type of appointments. Like, it doesn't need to stay at that level. But others, like, for example, specific specialties that already lack access, like there's no way a payer can say, okay, like telehealth needs to be less than an in-person because in that case, like it may be impossible to get an in-person one. And like the telehealth's the only way to go. And if that's the case, then like you have to reimburse at that same level. And so like I feel like what it's going to be is somewhere in between where like on the lower acuity side, it may be end up being closer to, or sorry, maybe lower than in person. But on the kind of specialty side, it'll be closer or equal to in person. And I think in the end, that'll still be a positive driver for virtual care overall. And similarly on the labor side as well, like I feel like it'll be some sort of compromise where you can access talent across regions because I think like as telehealth ramps up for health systems and for the broader use in the market, like the supply just isn't going to be there, like, in a state. Like we just don't have enough people within that. You need to tap external labor pools and like the traditional way is like you use like a teledoc or use like additional service to do that. But like that's not necessarily the most cost effective way to do things. And it's not the best way from a care coordination standpoint to do things. Like if you want to kind of keep things like in a continuity of care perspective, like you don't want to send someone externally. And so I think that'll be kind of the driver for, on the labor side, potentially enabling more cross-state licensure exceptions. And so like that's something that I'm hoping happens, but again, like it's kind of hard to predict how things land. That's just kind of my educated guess, I'd say.
It's tough to predict, and it's such a complex problem as well. And I think it's a good prediction. With I know we have a limited set of time, so I have one more question, and we'll go back on commenting on the cool factors of Providence Ventures. Real quick, it seems obvious, and you highlighted in your digital reports. I mean, are there categories that you're excited to see come forward post COVID? Healthcare categories, or at least generally healthcare technologies that you're excited to see come forward after COVID?
Yeah, I'm really excited about some of the growth in the market overall post COVID. So in particular, remote patient monitoring, it's one of those areas that's been around for a long time. Like I remember back in 2016, I met with a ton of companies in this realm. But in reality, it just never really got much traction in the past. But I'm seeing more recently that, these are companies that are really what's needed in the post-COVID world, like empowering patients at home. Because one of the key issues with telehealth is that there's no way to like measure vitals, and vitals are critical for any sort of like true care experience. Like you can do a telehealth visit, but if I can't tell what your blood pressure is, or I can't tell what your like your blood oxygen level is, or whatnot, like it's kind of like I just ask you some questions and you give me a feeler of it. But like RPM solutions that can enable and empower telehealth are definitely going to be an area for growth. And we're already seeing that, and that's specific to certain populations as well. So it's not like every single person in the country needs a blood pressure monitor at home, but if you're part of an ACO, or you're part of like like a medical group, or whatnot, like something like that would be essential for providing care in home and reducing costs and reducing the burden on both the patients and the providers. And so I see that space is growing. The second area is an area I hit on very briefly, which is AI solutions focused on telehealth. When you have telehealth visits, you're essentially recording interactions between a provider and a patient in a way that just hasn't happened before, and in a volume that hasn't happened before. Like the level of data you can acquire through that is exceptional. And so I think AI solutions that could either fit on the back end, meaning help in digital scribing, help in providing information to patients after the fact, like those are going to be in high demand and going to be needed. Like what I envision one day is just like if I'm having a telehealth visit with a provider, that there's maybe like like a little bot on the side that tells me like something, or sends me a link to something. If the doctor says, hey, you have X condition, you should be eating these type of foods. Hey, here's a link to that type of food. Click on that and you can get it into the background. And similarly, just something along those lines where you could really do that now with the data that you're going to acquire with these telehealth visits. And then I think that the last thing is just like the expansion of like virtual clinics. And what I mean by that is just the fact that there are going to be more and more providers on the virtual care side. And we need to have tools that can help empower those providers more effectively and build deeper networks of specialty and primary care providers who can kind of fill in those needs. And that gets to that vision that I described around like that seamless 1 time or 1 hour type experience where talk to a primary care provider, they refer you directly to the specialist gives you what you need, and then you get you get your care at a pharmacy, or you get your care after, maybe even delivered to your house. Like, and so that type of seamless type of experience requires like networks of providers and significant networks of providers. And again, that kind of goes into previous points around cross-state licensure and all these other things. But I think that's kind of another area that I'm excited to see some growth in.
Really cool. Well, I know we have a little bit of time left, so I want to spend that last bit of just kind of highlighting the uniqueness of Providence Ventures, because not only you are one of the top 5 largest hospitals in the United States, but you actually have what's called a digital innovation group, which is kind of like your internal synergy, if I'm not mistaken, right? Where it's you take a lot of your portfolio companies, what you mentioned earlier, and make sure that they can connect with all the right individuals across Providence Ventures. And I think this is a really, really great corporate venture approach. And I think probably one of the most effective. And feel free, do you have any comments on the structure?
Yeah, and so like I'll make a plug for a couple of the leaders. And so Aaron Martin on my team, who's our managing partner for Providence Ventures, is also the chief digital officer for Providence. And under his purview is a set of teams that are really unique to the healthcare system overall, as well as Providence in terms of their expertise level. And so, as you alluded to, like we have so many resources within Aaron's organization to both help our portfolio companies as well as help in our diligence process. The digital insight reports that you reference, they're published by our digital strategy team led by Sarah Vasey, who like her team has done a ton of work in all the areas that I mentioned, and help in conjunction with our team in terms of looking at these spaces from a health system perspective. Um, and so, having that team of like ex-consultants who are really sharp, just sitting, or they used to sit next to me, now they're just like a Zoom call away, but sitting next to us theoretically has been really helpful. Whenever we look at companies, they have connections into our system. Like we have a whole product development team that's led by some really talented engineers and product developer or product managers who build software for Providence, and at the same time have a deep knowledge set when it comes to all things technology. So anytime I see an AI solution, or anytime I see something that seems like magic, like I can kind of talk to them and they'll tell me if it's magic or not. And most of the times it's not magic, but like they'll explain why. And so it's great to have that resource. And then in addition, like Aaron also has a really talented digital marketing organization, which, if you look at healthcare systems, marketing is not their strongest point. If you look at some websites, like from other health systems, it's not necessarily very clean. Our websites are done very well. Like our SEO strategy is done very effectively because of this marketing team. At the same time, they're a very valuable resource when it comes to anything related to the patient experience. And so anything along those lines, they've been very helpful with. And to your point again, like all of these resources are available to our portfolio companies. And so like whenever our portfolio companies fit into any of those realms, like they have access to this team of people, which can be really valuable for their development and their growth, as well as these thought leaders. And so it's a really great model that, 6 years ago when I joined, it wasn't like this. But Aaron and his organization has really built something that I think is unique in the marketplace, and something that really helps provide a lot of value to not only Providence, but I think more broadly to the healthcare system overall.
Awesome. It's really impressive, the structure you guys built. I think that's a solid foundation for a corporate venture firm. I know we're on our last minute here. Thank you so much for taking the full hour with me. Before I close out, Cyril, this fantastic interview, by the way, awesome insights. Did you have anything you wanted to announce to the audience before we close out?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this interview. Like I view it as a way to both provide some insights into Providence Ventures as well as connect with your audience. And so I'm sure your audience will get access to like at least my LinkedIn profile. And so, any companies out there that are looking to connect with a health system venture fund like Providence, feel free to reach out. We're always looking to talk with companies and innovative systems or innovative companies. And so please reach out. I think that's kind of the key thing that I'll leave on from this interview. But again, appreciate the time and appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this.
Yeah, thanks again. I mean, for the audience in perspective, I mean, the basis for having this interview was being able to highlight as you one of the top healthcare investors globally. And we all know, we've got to see the reasons, a lot of the reasons why, your perspective, your approach to healthcare is being more than supportive, whether or not you make investments or not, bringing those companies back into Providence with your overarching goal of making sure that you can support Providence. And you've done that from the beginning. You're at the beginning of the fund. But being able to navigate and talk about how you guys have been able to navigate the pandemic in unique ways and provide content and give that back to the community is really impressive. On top of that, you have, I think, one of the most impressive corporate venture capital funds, especially for the healthcare industry. Providers are tough to work with, and you make it super easy. I mean, you are the access point that makes it, I mean, you have not only the largest healthcare system at your disposal, you have a fantastic team that kind of puts together the work to not only identify great opportunities, both internally and externally, and then you're that bridge. And then you provide support on top of that for your portfolio companies in a lot of different ways. So absolutely incredible. I'm super happy to not only have this opportunity to interview you, but feature you as one of the best, I think, for sure, one of the best healthcare venture investors globally. So this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Cyril.
Great. I appreciate the time and appreciate the opportunity here.